Would you believe me if I told you that George Harrison hated participating in the recording sessions for Sgt. Pepper? I know that it sounds crazy. I mean, Sgt. Pepper is one of the greatest albums of all time, and actually a lot of people label it as the greatest achievement in recording history, so any artist would love to be a part of a project like that. But George Harrison has always been different, he literally said that the recording sessions for the album felt more like an assembly process, not really a band, and it was extremely boring. And once you understand how Sgt. Pepper was recorded, you can kind of see what he meant. You see, albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver are not only seen as influential because of how they sound, but also because of how they were crafted. There was a lot of experimentation going on in the studio, and they wanted to continue that trend in the next album that was Sgt. Pepper. This basically meant that the boys were not working together all the time. Sometimes they crafted different parts of the song in different parts of the studio at different times, so it was obviously, it didn't feel like a band. It was more like an assembly process, like George said. For John Lennon and Paul McCartney, this was a great opportunity because they had a lot of songs they wanted to make, but George was limited to 1 or 2 songs per album, 3 in the case of Revolver, so he wasn't that invested in the crafting of the album, resulting in probably the weakest point of his songwriting while being in the Beatles, with songs like Within You, Without You, Blue Jay Way, and for example, It's All Too Much, that was written around this time too. It's said that it was around this time that his relationship with Paul McCartney started to go south, and it makes a lot of sense since Paul McCartney basically masterminded this entire album. It's also around this time that he started to think of the possibility of leaving the Beatles and maybe doing something on his own, which resulted on the Wonderwall Music soundtrack and the Electronic Sounds album. And it's easy to understand why George felt this way. After 1965, his awakening as a songwriter and delivering songs like I Need You, Taxman, I Want to Tell You, Love You Too, Think for Yourself, If I Needed Someone, some of the best songs by the band around that time, going back to, the backseat, not really being a protagonist in the albums anymore, not even as a guitarist, because in Sgt. Pepper, it's not exactly a guitar album. It was probably frustrating. And I think this also shows the massive difference between George Harrison and John Lennon and Paul McCartney, okay? They were basically redesigning music with the psychedelic movement, and George couldn't keep up. It feels like he didn't really adapt to the psychedelic movement that well, and that's the reason why you have some of his worst songs with the Beatles around this time. And this is one of the main reasons every single time someone tells me that George was the quiet Beatle or the most peaceful member of the band, I laugh a little, because if you study the story of the bands from 1965 onward, he was constantly complaining and constantly protesting against, the direction John and Paul were leading the band in. So when you consider the fact that he wasn't able to fully adapt as a songwriter to the new psychedelic era of the band, and his relationship with Paul McCartney was not that great around this time, the guy that basically masterminded this entire album and Magical Mystery Tour as well, I think it's pretty easy to see why he didn't enjoy his time recording this album.